Well, should you wager on God? Pascal's infamous wager might be one of the most misunderstood, arguments when it comes to the Christian case. And nearly all atheists, particularly atheist apologists, seem to get this one wrong. So, to help set the record straight, to dive into Pascal's wager and to go beyond Pascal's wager, I have a fantastic guest for today's show. My name's Dan Patterson, and this is Questioning Christianity, the channel helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. And it is my honor to introduce onto the channel for the first time Professor Douglas Groothuis. Doug, it's great to have you on.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Doug, you have a very extended career exploring Christian apologetics and worldview and ethics. You've been a professor in a number of different universities and seminaries across North America. You've been the author of 20-something books, sort of in that space. People might be most familiar with about a decade ago when you brought out Christian apologetics as sort of a base text. But the book we're going to be particularly diving into today is this one called Beyond the Wager, which came out much more recently last year and is a bit of an update on your work on Pascal. You did your PhD thesis, I understand, actually digging into what he understands about the project of natural theology and some of his concerns about the arguments that people put forward there. But particularly in this Beyond the Wager, you kind of dive into the enduring legacy of Pascal on a whole range of subjects, which I hope we'll get to dig into a little bit. For anyone that's watching, just in case you haven't already, it would be great for you to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. And if you're wanting to ask Professor Doug a question in this live stream, please go and do that in the chat. Just preface it with a little Q. And as always, we really appreciate super chats to help keep the channel going, and we'll prioritize those in the Q&A section as we go. Doug, would you be able to give us maybe just a thumbnail sketch of what got you interested in Blaise Pascal?
Well, it was a long time ago. It was about 1977, and I was in college. I'd heard a little bit about Blaise Pascal, not very much. And I went home for the summer to be with my mom in Anchorage, Alaska, and she had the great books collection that was put together, I think, in the 1950s by Mortimer Adler and a few other folks. And one of the volumes was Pascal, so I pulled it out and started reading it. And what captured me more than anything was his understanding of human nature and how the Christian worldview explains the greatness of humanity and the misery of humanity far better than any other worldview. And of course, he was a masterful stylist, knew how to turn a metaphor, get your attention. He was a remarkably brilliant scientist, mathematician, polemicist, and so on. So my start with Pascal was many years ago, 1977, and I've continued to read and study him through these years. I taught a class for many years at Denver Seminary called The Philosophy of Blaise Pascal, and wrote my PhD dissertation actually on something I disagree with Pascal about. I say he's my favorite philosopher, but I wrote a dissertation on what I disagree with him on. We won't go into this. It may come up in a minute, but Pascal did not like using any of the standard arguments for God's existence, like the cosmological argument, the design argument. And I looked at about 5 reasons he gave for not using those arguments, and I didn't think any of them were sufficient. But I used this principle with Pascal, especially with the wager. Pascal is smarter than you are. So if you think Pascal has said something just ridiculous or absurd, or how could he not have thought about this objection to what he said, remember, he's smarter than you are. So it took me like 300 pages to show that he was wrong about his rejection of natural theology. But there's so much that is so right and cogent and compelling about Pascal, not just in apologetics, but in philosophy of science, actually in some areas of theology, experimental science, so many things. But yeah, he has been a long-term conversation partner and mentor to me, so to speak.
My first interaction with it was not dissimilar to you. I had to write a book summary for my first paper at Oxford, and I remember picking up a copy of Les Pensées, or his thoughts. For anyone who's unfamiliar, Pascal's got a broad set of writings, particularly in more of his scientific and philosophical works. A series of letters that he wrote defending his particular theological convictions as sort of a sect within Catholicism, the Jansenites. But Les Pensées is actually his attempt at writing an apology for the Christian faith, or his defense for the Christian faith, that he never completed. And one of the things that maybe first-time readers say, what's going on here? Unless you read the preface or someone explains to you first, it is a series of disconnected thoughts, hence pensée in French, but it was collated by his family in the aftermath of his death. Sort of 39 years old, 40 years old, very young man when he died. But they've tried to group these individual thoughts, and there's hundreds of them. Some of them a sentence long or a couple of words, others paragraphs and pages, but into major themes so that we can get something of a thumbnail sketch of what he was working at and how he would frame those sorts of arguments. And I just remember being blown away by some of his insights, particularly around that description of human nature as sort of this two-sided coin, the divine and the diabolical, created in God's image for good, but also damaged by evil, and that high calling, and then that animal nature. And there's just some wonderful insight in kind of how he shapes that. And I guess that influences a lot of his thinking and theology about what kind of arguments and case for God might be successful. But as you're reading through Pensée, do you have any favorites that stick out? Anyone says, what's your favorite of his thoughts? Anyone come to mind that you can quote?
Well, there are so many. My favorite argument of his is actually not the wager. I think the wager is profound, and it's also profoundly misunderstood and caricatured. We'll talk about that. But I think his most cogent and compelling argument for Christianity is what I call the anthropological argument, or the deposed royalty argument that you just sketched. And that is that Christianity is unique among all the religions and all the philosophies in terms of understanding the greatness of the human condition, our intellectual greatness, our moral greatness, our creative greatness, and also understanding how far wrong we have gone as sinners. Because you've got creation and fall. So we are the corruption of something great. We're not zeros, we're not nothing, we're not mere animals, nor are we gods who forgot their deity. So I think his insights into the human condition, looking at both the greatness and the misery of humanity, you can call that an anthropological argument, is profound. And also it's a one-step argument, because it says that we need to explain who we are as humans. And if you don't think we should, you need to wake up, because we should be self-aware. And in fact, our eternal destiny may depend on how self-aware we are in relation to God. And it's not just we have an argument for God as creator, or God as designer, or God as lawgiver. We have the Christian worldview explaining the greatness and misery of the human condition according to creation and fall. And then also you got creation, fall, of course, and redemption. And some of the most beautiful passages and profound places in the Pensée are about Jesus Christ. So this is not usually emphasized in books about Pascal. So I have a chapter in my book, Beyond the Wager, on the excellence of Jesus. And he's got an apologetic there based on his unique attributes, his wisdom, of course, his resurrection, and so on. But I really resonate with that argument from human nature.
Yeah, I really love the Jesus one as well. Tom Gilson's book, Too Good Not to Be True, sort of wrestling with that. And the genius of Jesus is something that seems almost impossible to invent. But I completely agree on the anthropological argument. I found the diagnostic power of the Christian story to be profound in how it sheds light on who we are. And he, in the book, says this is something that every religion needs to be tested by. And he sort of makes the unique claim that Christianity, as one amongst many stories attempting to explain the world, is the one that, kind of like C.S. Lewis's argument, really does shed light on reality. I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. So I certainly was drawn to that my first read through, and since I keep coming back to those passages.
It's interesting too that you were mentioning that he wasn't able to finish the work. He died before he finished this defense of Christianity, so all we have is fragments. But there are a lot of very profound fragments about creation and fall and redemption, and the explanatory power of the Christian view. So what I've done in several places in articles and books is I've tried to present it as a formal argument. And the argument form is abduction or inference to the best explanation. So you're trying to explain something, the human condition. You have a limited number of worldview possibilities, and those possibilities need to account for our uniqueness morally, cognitively, creatively, and also our unique wretchedness is the term that he uses, our foibles, our fragility, our abject evil in many cases. So it's not just interesting reflections on the human condition from a Christian, true, but he formulates it, or it can be formulated in the spirit of Pascal as an abductive argument or argument to the best explanation using certain criteria. And then you can stack it up with the Islamic view of humanity, the Hindu view of humanity, the secular humanist view of humanity. And you have a very nice comparative apologetic when you use that method. And I've done that many times.
And one that I think most people would want to be true, in the sense that it does give profound dignity to our humanity and all of the capacities that come from being created in God's image. But it also just helps explain what's wrong within us, in that everyone looks within and they find shadows and things that worry and scare them and confuse them. But it's helpful to have this point of diagnosis, say, I actually know what my condition is, therefore I know what remedy to seek after, which is also unfolded in the Christian story. What role do you see Pascal's famous Night of Fire playing into his apology?
Well, on one level, it doesn't play in at all. On another level, it's profoundly significant. And let me explain that, because I don't like contradiction. On one level, it's not pertinent because he did not reveal the record of his mystical experience to anyone during his lifetime. So if people don't know the backstory here, after he died, they found that one of his sports coats, or one of his commonly worn coats, had something sewn into the inner part of it, the inner, I guess, lapel part of it. And it was a record of this profound experience with God, which has been called the Night of Fire. And I include that in my book, Beyond the Wager. He never told anyone about it. No one. It was never included in the Pensées. But when you read the Pensées, it's included because it was found after he died. But it would not have been included as part of the formal argument. However, it was a turning point in his life where he wanted to fully dedicate himself to defending the Christian faith. And after that point, I believe it was 1654, he spent most all of his time working on this thorough defense of the Christian faith. So we have some of the arguments laid out in a few paragraphs. Sometimes we just have one sentence. We also have programmatic statements about how the book should unfold. So we take that material, and various people such as myself and Peter Kraft and Tom Morris and Michael Rhoda and others have tried to understand what that completed, integrated argument would look like. So the Night of Fire, I think, was a turning point for him. I believe Blaise Pascal was a Christian. He was a follower of Jesus before this, but he had some ups and downs. He had a period where actually his physician told him that he was working himself into the grave with all of his scientific pursuits and other pursuits, and he needed to lighten up a little bit and enjoy himself. So he entered what's sometimes called the worldly period, where he would associate with his worldly friends and maybe get interested in gambling. Of course, he understood probability theory. He invented probability theory, which plays a role in the wager. I don't think he became a worldling or was dissolute or, became like Rouault for 3 months or something. Not Rouault, Rousseau. Not Rouault, like Rousseau for 3 months. I've been studying Rousseau. Oh, what a horrible task that is. But but anyway, this Night of Fire was a turning point for him in the ardor of his devotion in defending the Christian faith. Now, some people like Bertrand Russell and a few others have said that he gave up on science after this. He didn't care about science. He became very ascetic and world denying. That's not true. He just changed his focus. In fact, he still continued to do some work in mathematics and science after this. It's just that he channeled his vast intellectual and rhetorical powers in this direction up until the time of his death.
Yeah. All right, well, let's maybe dive into the wager then, because it seems that almost everyone gets Pascal's wager wrong. I've listened to a bunch of secular thinkers and atheists over the years. Christopher Hitchens rubbished it in the final years of his own life. Richard Dawkins has made disparaging comments about it just being sort of a fake test that's pushed upon you. More YouTube famous people like Stephen Woodford of Rationality Rules and Genetically Modified Skeptic, Matt Dillahunty. The list just goes on of secular thinkers who write this off as having no real enduring value. But they all seem to miss something. And many of the objections that get raised to it, I think, bear this out, exactly what Pascal was doing in that project. So do you want to maybe sketch out for us Pascal's wager in its proper philosophical and spiritual context?
Right. Well, it's not easy because the pensées were not finished, and this particular fragment was one piece of paper that was folded up, and there were margins where you find writing, and so reconstructing it is a little bit of a challenge in a linear sequence, but I think you can do it. There are a lot of things to consider here. The first is the wager is not an argument for God's existence. You often hear it put that way. It is a program for religious rationality. There's a big difference between the two. So an argument for God's existence is going to be something like the cosmological argument, the design argument, the moral argument, or even Pascal's anthropological argument is an argument for the entire Christian worldview. But the wager is a challenge to the skeptic who is not convinced by the evidence for Christianity. So it starts with a prologue that talks about the transcendence of God. The word that Pascal uses is the infinity of God. And so the infinite annihilates the finite, and the infinite is beyond our comprehension and understanding. So because of that, we shouldn't expect to be able to fully establish the existence of God, given this vast difference between the infinity of God and the finitude of people. All right, so full stop. That's a tough portion of the wager to interpret. You can interpret it charitably or uncharitably. The uncharitable interpretation is Pascal has already cut his own throat. If we know nothing about God, we can have no wager, no program for coming to be a Christian. Everything is dead in the water right now. Or the approach that I take, looking at the whole corpus of evidence and arguments he gives in the Pensées, is that he's saying to the skeptic, it's difficult to understand the nature of God. It's not a simple thing to show there is a God as opposed to not being a God. So we should be humble about it and consider not only the theoretical reasons for believing in God, but what are called the prudential reasons. So if the odds are just absolutely minute that God exists, then even if you would have a fantastic payoff if you believe in God exists, you would still be sacrificing your rationality to believe in God on the off chance that that God does exist, and then God would reward you for your belief. So the first hurdle is, has the prologue made God unknown? If so, the argument doesn't go anywhere. I think a charitable and plausible interpretation is the one that I just said. Now, the second one is where he lays out the prudential possible outcomes. And I think you had a slide on that one. So let's say you believe in God and God does exist. Your belief correlates with objective reality. Then you become a follower of God and you have an infinite gain, what he calls an infinity of an infinitely happy life. That's how I put it. You believe in God and God does not exist. You have a finite loss because you lose certain worldly pleasures in trying to be a Christian. If you don't believe in God and God exists, then you lose an infinity of an infinitely happy life. It's an infinite loss. If you don't believe in God and God does not exist, you have the gain of being right. You got it right. There is no God. So you gain that, but still, the way Pascal lays it out, when you die, you die. So there's no afterlife consideration. So if you look at this and don't factor in any epistemic qualities, you have some problem. Or if you say something like, well, maybe the odds of God's existing are only 5% or 10% or something like that. So do you really want to try to believe that when the odds are so low? The way that I cash it out, and there are some interpretive issues to work with, I think Pascal says to the skeptic who's not convinced, by the way, you've got to situate this. The skeptic who's not convinced by the argument, is there about a 50-50 chance of the Christian God being real? If so, we've got to move from theoretical reason to prudential reason, because prudential reason has to do with benefits accruing upon belief. So Pascal thinks that this is not a trivial issue. This is a consequential issue. Secondly, it's not something that you can really avoid. So if the Christian view is correct, you have one life to get right with God. So it's a momentous choice. It's not a trivial choice. And it's also a forced choice. Think of an example of where you have a physical symptom and you think it could be nothing or it could be cancer. Big deal. I'll just let it go. No, that's absurd. You need to investigate it. And sorry for all the hypochondriacs out there, but let's say you find a funny spot on your skin and you say, what is that? Maybe that's nothing. Maybe it's melanoma. Well, who cares? No, you have to care. So it's not trivial. It's momentous, and it's really forced, because if it is something serious, this could take you out. This could kill you. And the Christian perspective is that we all have a terminal disease, sin, and we can inherit eternal punishment if we do not avail ourselves of the work of Christ. So my take on it is that prologue is really for the hardened skeptic. And if we can get sort of 50-50 odds for the Christian God, and then you look at the prudential benefits of believing if there is a God, that trumps everything else. That swamps everything else. Now, at this point, you can say, well, still, it seems pretty self-aggrandizing. Aren't you kind of giving up your intellect on the off chance, even it's a 50-50 chance, that there is a God? Well, I don't think you should stop there, because there's a third part, and actually a fourth part to the wager. The third part is what you can call a devotional experiment. So the unbeliever, this is a dialogue, the wager. The unbeliever says, yes, I really should believe, given the way you've laid out the prudential quadrant, so to speak, the way you put it. I should believe, but I can't. Something's wrong. I can't do it. And so Pascal says, well, other people have been in your situation. They've been attracted to the Christian message, and they've had trouble believing. So you have to go beyond just the argument and simply the rational calculation of benefits and losses relative to what's real. You have to actually participate in religious ceremonies to help you believe. Now, a lot of people at this point go crazy. They say, oh gosh, Pascal has already cut his head off by saying God is unknowable. He makes it a crass, self-interested decision, and now he's telling everybody to brainwash themselves to be believers. All right, let's back up a little bit. And what he's saying is that there's more to belief than merely assessing evidence and looking at possibilities and prudential outcomes. There is a participatory element in coming to believe, a practice. And he is not saying to nullify your reason by religious practices. That's a very negative, uncharitable, I think, impossible way actually of viewing this. I think what he's saying is, he says, you will come to believe as many others have come to believe in this way. So he says at this point, what's limiting you from believing in God is really not your theoretical reason and not your prudential reason. It's your passion. There's something inside of you that's keeping you. And of course, from a Christian worldview, that's pride, the offense of the cross that ultimately repels people from God. And Pascal says, he's Roman Catholic, he says, go to Mass and so on and be involved in religious ceremonies and you'll find yourself believing. Mm. Well, I don't think that that's a program for religious indoctrination. Throughout the wager, you've got the sense that there are reasons to believe. At one point he says there's scripture and the rest. And then if we build in the anthropological argument, if we build in some of the other arguments, let's say the skeptic says it's 50-50 whether or not there's a God. I do see that if I believe in the Christian God, the benefits are tremendous, they're eternal in this life and the next. And so I'll go into a devotional experiment, so to speak, and see what happens. At that point, and I'm going a little beyond what the wager says, but at that point, the believer might say, well, I'm starting to get a sense or a feel or a practice that this may be true. So I want to go back and look at some of those arguments that left me cold before, or those arguments from prophecy or the uniqueness and finality of Jesus. I want to go back to those and look at those again, because I see the religious activity is not mindless brainwashing. So I think the wager, again, is not an argument for God's existence. It is an argument for a program of religious rationality and for a devotional experiment. And the last part of the wager, I actually find very moving, although almost nobody ever talks about it. It's where Pascal says that I went down on my knees before the universal being and asked God to give me an argument that would help you become a Christian. I just love that. This brilliant mathematician, scientist, philosopher is just so ardent that his unbelieving, skeptical friends come to Christ. That proves that.
That's beautiful. And there's a ton of dimensions that I'd love to dig into behind this, but maybe the best way to draw out some of the misunderstanding of the wager isn't just the positive explication you've just given, but by diving into some of the common objections. And it does not take you long if you watch a few videos on YouTube around objections to Pascal's wager. You see them both from skeptics as well as from Christian believers. Let's start maybe with the impossibility objection. And you've already hinted at this a little bit. It's the idea that, look, belief in God, that's just not a flip that I can switch at any point that I want to. And so it's this maybe wrestle between different notions of belief, the voluntarist and involuntarist notions in philosophy. Can you really choose what you believe? And how that sort of, should we be aiming then? Are we pretending to believe? Is that kind of his practical encouragement, or is there something more noble that he's pushing?
Yeah, he's not at all.
I think like the skeptical way that this is said is, hey, you want me to fake it, being religious and just go along to church and pretend? I don't think that's really going to impress God.
Yeah, fake it till you make it to heaven, right? No, that's not what Pascal had in mind. And, there's a belief that's called doxastic voluntarism. It's just a fancy word for I can make myself believe X or Y, the same way I can make myself raise my hand. That's not how belief works. Belief emerges through practices, through investigation, I'd say also should through prayer and counsel. So what Pascal is saying is, I've given you the reasons to investigate. And if you believe, and there's good incentive that you ought to believe, there are tremendous benefits. So it's worth what some have called a devotional experiment. He's not saying you can just flip a switch and believe in the Christian God. By no means. So that, just read the wager, people. You know what I mean? If you read it, you'll see that objection doesn't even obtain. It's just a straw man argument.
And I think that's a lot of people maybe don't even read the text of Ponce's. And, it's a few pages that spell out the wager. It's much more likely they've seen someone spell it out in 30 seconds, or they've seen a graphic like what I put up before as sort of an explanatory overview, and they assume then what they think he's doing
Yeah.
rather than reading it in context. What about this idea, like the irrationality objection, which is that critics argue our belief should be based off evidence and not just self-interested pragmatic reasoning? I mean, is God really
Mhm.
going to be pleased with a selfish gamble, or
Yeah.
do you think because of my motives, he's going to reject me anyway?
Well, Jesus said, "What is it worth if you gain the whole world and lose your soul?" So a lot of our investigation into truth claims has to do with what I would call rational self-interest. Your eternal destiny should be a matter of your rational self-interest and that of others as well. I think it was Peter Kraft who said that you can make this more altruistic as well, because if Christianity is the way, then not only do you want to be forgiven of your sin and have eternity with God, you would want others to be as well. So you'd want to tell them and convince them as well. So it doesn't have to be purely personal. There can be an altruistic element to it also.
Mm.
Um, and as I tried to show, it's not irrational. It just says that the theoretical evidence may not get you all the way there, but there's still prudential reasons to pursue the truth or falsity, not to brainwash yourself. Again, I think that's a very implausible and uncharitable understanding of what Pascal has to say. And in fact, you could give an example of this, which I gave in an article. Actually, I don't remember if I put it in the book, but it's in an article. Let's say you have two actors, an older actor who's very well accomplished and very cocky, and this younger actor who is now being billed as one of the greatest actors of all time. And the older actor says, "Oh, he's an upstart. I can outact him in my sleep. He's no good." And someone says, "Well, wait a minute. Have you actually sat down and watched all of his movies with an open mind?" "No, I don't need to." "Well, why don't you do it? Why don't you sit down and watch this young actor act various roles, various dramatic roles, even does comedies, and just let yourself take him in to see if it might be your passion, your pride that says he's not a very good actor.
Mm.
It may be your pride and not an accurate, humble evaluation of his
Mm.
ability." So I'm saying that certain religious practices can help discern the objective truth of what is being claimed. It's not a substitute for reason or evidence. And actually, my own apologetic system includes a lot of natural theology and a lot of evidence for God and Christianity that Pascal does not give. He's got the argument from fulfilled prophecy, the uniqueness of Jesus, the resurrection, the anthropological argument. He's got some arguments against Islam that I think are quite profound that are usually not mentioned. I mention those in the book. So I think we can take the wager insight and then make it a lot more epistemically robust
Mm.
by adding in a lot of positive arguments that he did not add. But even if you take the wager the way it is, give it a charitable reading, I don't think that these typical objections you hear really obtain.
Yeah, and I resonate a lot with the idea that there's something to the sociology of knowledge and the
Oh, yeah.
epistemic and
Yeah.
moral virtues that we have to form to be able to come at something from different sides, and how at first from the outside something can just seem entirely ridiculous until you get on the inside and talk with people who believe it and why, and explore the impact upon their life and the different dimensions on how it shapes
Yeah.
who they are and how they act, and all of a sudden you start to see things through a very different lens.
Yeah.
And I think that's what he's encouraging. And if you were to put it in a theological context, it might be, well, go to the kinds of places that God has promised to make himself known. And
Mhm.
we'll dig into some of the dimensions that how that connects with divine hiddenness in just a little while. But I want to get to maybe the biggest objection, which is the many gods objection. Now, atheists will often object to Pascal's wager and say, well, wager on God. Well, which God? Why Yahweh, or the God of Christianity? Why not Allah or Zeus or some other Norse deity? Now, I know this is something that Michael Roeder particularly picks up on in his reframing of the argument in taking Pascal's wager, and others have suggested that maybe Pascal's wager might be more carefully reframed, like Joseph Butler's version, which came sort of a century after his version of the wager. But how do you think Pascal might address this many gods objection?
Yeah. Well, you have to look at it in two dimensions. One is he's writing for a skeptic in 17th century France. So what are going to be the religious options for a skeptic in 17th century France? Basically, Protestantism, Catholicism, atheism, skepticism. Maybe this person may have heard a little bit about Islam. So he's really focusing on the available options for someone at that time. So he does have things to say against Islam. He's got a very strong argument against Muhammad, that Muhammad was not foretold through prophecy the way Jesus was, and he did not make any prophecies that were fulfilled the way Jesus did. So I think he's got an argument against Islam, so we can deal with that, although it's not built into the wager. When you look at the larger collection, the total collection of the Pensées, he's got some things about that. He's got, what we can get to this, an approach to skepticism, which is actually very different than Descartes, but I think helpful and worthwhile. So, yeah, if you leave it at strictly theoretical, then, certain wise guys have said, well, maybe there's a God who sends people to hell who believe in him and sends people to heaven who don't believe in him. So if it's just endless possibilities of weird deities, yeah, the argument fails. But if you talk about the situatedness of what he was doing for his group of people, it makes a lot more sense. And moreover, you can just build in more of Pascal's specific arguments for Christianity at this point, particularly the anthropological argument, which I think is probably the most developed and the most cogent of all of his apologetic arguments. So are we going a little beyond the wager here? We are, but it's still Pascal. It's still Pascal's arguments, and it's Pascal's wager. And remember, he never finished any of this. And much of the Pensée would probably have been a dialogue between a believer and an unbeliever, because we have dialogical fragments. So you're taking a dialogue between a hardened skeptic. Pascal's trying to work with him. He gets him to the point where he wants to believe, and then he gives him some instructions to how the man might believe. That's what this does. It would have been part of a much larger defense of the Christian religion. So I need to keep that in mind.
Absolutely. And just making the broader case for Christianity in terms of the evidentialist approach. I mean, he's got the heart has reasons, which reason does not know, which is a fascinating line we'll probably come back to a little bit later. But certainly he's making a case for why Christianity rises to the surface against other perspectives when it does come to the available evidence. And then you're still left with that degree of mystery. Is that enough to convince everyone? Well, it doesn't seem to be. So what do you do if you remain unconvinced and you're sort of on the fence still? That's where the wager's sort of stepping in. Well, can we ask a question then just about part of the dynamics of the wager? And if we come back to this grid, some of the pushback has been, okay, we understand the afterlife consideration, that if there is an afterlife, God does exist and we believe in him, infinite gain, because we get eternal life with God in his presence, fullness of joy. And if there is an afterlife and God exists, well, and we don't believe in him, well, then there's going to be infinite loss because we miss out on that eternal life, and the sin that we have committed is going to warrant just punishment. And so there's this real contrast there. Totally understand. But let's say God does not exist and therefore the afterlife consideration isn't there. Some skeptics will say it's just too much to wager, in the sense that the losses that we might experience in this life are serious. So I think of one respondent to the wager, runs a channel called Genetically Modified Skeptic. He's in the US, a deconversion from being raised in Christianity. And he says, no, there is real loss in this life if Christianity is not true. And then he gives a series of examples. So he talks about the pursuit of guilt-free sex, despite whatever sexual orientation you have. He says, look, you get your Sunday mornings back if Christianity isn't part of your pursuits in life. He said you may have perhaps better financial freedom because you're not having to give money towards church or the poor or Christian organizations. You can choose where you charitably give. Basically, you have freedom to choose your own path. You're not trying to discern God's will, or no one can tell you what to do. And I want to dig in because I actually think this is a meaningful objection that some people get stuck on. I remember hearing Alex O'Connor talk about, well, how long should I continue to seek after God if doing that is going to force moral decisions that may take away something I see as being good? If Pascal was to listen to that kind of pushback, and how might you extend a response from the resources that he offers in the wager?
Well, if we're contrasting Christianity with atheism, if that's the dichotomy we're looking at, then on atheism, nothing has ultimate significance. You end up with nihilism because there's no God to give meaning or significance or value to anything. Whatever experiences you have end when you die, and eventually you're totally forgotten. So do these things really have any lasting value in a godless world? The answer is no. But let's just look at social science for a minute. And there's a good article in First Things on this, 6 or 8 months ago. I'm sorry I don't have the exact material, but I think it was called A Second Look at Pascal's Wager. You can simply look at the pragmatic benefits of religious belief and religious behavior in terms of happiness, mental health, physical health, longevity, and so on. And you find that religious people in general, and being a little broader than just Christians, tend to be happier, have intact families, have better mental health, better physical health, tend to be less depressed, etc., than people without any religious beliefs. So if you just want to look at the empirical social science data, apart, and I don't like to do this, apart from whether or not there is a God, the religious people actually end up happier and with a more fulfilled life. And how well has the sexual revolution worked out for us, by the way? You know, sex without consequences, sex without morality, sex without a context of right and wrong. I think a lot of people are starting to see that that ends up as a kind of erotic nihilism.
Yeah, Louise Perry's book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, is one secular academic wrestling with that. I think it's fascinating. But that sociological argument I've actually found really helpful. Yes, you are going to make certain sacrifices and say no to certain desires. I mean, Jesus says plainly to come after him is to take up your cross and follow him. But it does seem to be when he says, I've come to give life and life to the full, that has measurable outcomes.
Well, then the question is, if this social science data is true, and I've been watching this quite a bit for about 10 years with Rodney Stark, and Brooks has written on this, can't think of his first name. You have to ask the question, if this is true, that family structure, a well-balanced life, moderation, sexual limits, a life of generosity, involvement in religious communities, why is it that these things would lead to human flourishing? Well, I have a good answer for that. Because Christianity
Christian story may be true.
Yeah,
I actually remember Robin Hanson was on Sam Harris's podcast years ago, and he's a economist and philosopher and physicist, and he's wrestling with this social science data, and he says, gee, this is a real puzzle if you think they're all just making it up. And I just thought, wow, it's such an insightful comment. But Pascal seems to respond to this explicitly in the wager. Let me read from Ponce 233. He says, now, what harm will befall you in taking this side? You will be faithful, honest, humble, grateful, generous, a sincere friend, truthful. Certainly you will not have any of those poisonous pleasures, glory, and luxury. But will you not have others? I will tell you that you will thereby gain in this life, and that at each step you take on this road, you will see so great certainty of gain, so much nothingness in what you risk, that you will at last recognize that you have wagered for something certain and infinite, for which you have given nothing.
Yeah,
I just think that's such a beautiful
line. Certain. Notice he says certain. So he's saying through
Yeah.
the religious life, you gain a kind of certainty because you're flourishing as a human being. You're going with the grain of the universe. David Brooks was the name I was looking for previously.
Yeah.
He's done a lot of work
Yeah.
on this too. And
Yeah.
religious people tend to be more generous, more happy, etc. Well, I'd say that's part of the confirmation structure of a good apologetics.
Mm.
Uh, we're offering a hypothesis, and if it's true, we should see X, Y, and Z, and we should see that an earnest religious life has more meaning and value and satisfaction than an irreligious life. And I mean
Mm.
specifically a Christian life, not just generic religion. And I think we find that.
Mm. Well, certainly a lot of the sociological data is drawn from heavily Christianized countries where they're doing
Yeah,
those
yeah,
analyses. Yeah.
right.
Um, how might then, if we take Pascal's wager and say, look, this isn't an argument for God's existence, but it's a pragmatic argument saying you're already wagering with your life either towards God or not. How might you use this meaningfully in God conversations at a street level? So someone's talking to you about faith, and they're like, "Oh, you're a religious person. You believe in God." I don't really believe myself. I don't know what to make of it. Where would you bring the wager into a conversation with a friend?
Well, I think I would first of all ask someone, how much have you looked into Christianity? Do you know what a Christian perspective on life is? How much of the Bible have you read? Have you read any defenses of Christianity? Do you really know what the arguments and evidence might be? And if someone says, no, I'm just not that interested, I'm too busy. And I said, well, let's consider this. If Christianity is true and you are a Christian, you will have a radically different life and eternal life with God and all the redeemed in the most wonderful, beautiful place you can imagine. Isn't that worth investigating? Isn't that worth some time looking into it, just given the possible benefits? And what if God holds you accountable for your conscience and your sin? And there's a last judgment, and you fail, and you do not merit eternal life because only Christ can merit that for you. Isn't that something you'd want to look into?
Mm.
And I think there the medical references can be helpful because
Yeah.
people are not relativists or pragmatists when it comes to their health. It's basically, am I sick or not? And if I'm sick, I want to get better. It's not, I mean, they're pragmatists in the sense that they want to get well if they're sick, but people are not relativists or non-realists or
Mm.
apathetic typically about their health.
Mm.
So if you have a serious condition, you want it to be diagnosed and you want it to be treated. That's just for this life. Well, the Christian message, which has been around for 2,000 years, billions of people have believed it, some of the greatest intellectuals of all time, like Pascal, like Aquinas, like C.S. Lewis, or contemporary analytic philosophers, Alvin Flanagan, J.P. Moreland, etc., have taken this to be true and meaningful. And so isn't it worth investigating
Mm.
just for rational self-interest? And Pascal, we haven't talked about this, has some very deep psychological, spiritual insights into how we try to avoid God through what he calls diversion.
Mm.
He says, because we can't solve our own problems, we can't make ourselves immortal, we don't want to think about it.
Mm.
We're about to go over the cliff of death and we put something in front of it to make us stop thinking about it instead of getting to the root of the matter. And
That's so descriptive of our current age.
it is, yeah.
But that's such a
Amusing
value in
ourselves to
terms of
death, as Neil Postman put it many years ago.
what was that? Sorry.
Yeah, Neil Postman in his book many years ago, Amusing Ourselves to Death.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're
Absolutely.
distracting ourselves.
Yeah. And I think maybe you've put your finger right on the button of where I think the value of the wager is in this era is there is such a spiritual apathy as a whole. When I'm talking to people on a range of religious questions, for most people, it's not a hard atheism that says there's no God or there is some kind of divine being, but I hate him, and an anti-theism. But it seems to be just a broad apathy. Life's going fine. I don't really think much about the God question. And the wager can be a real antidote to apathy, boast positively, hey, there's something on offer here which is infinitely good, but also sometimes you need a little bit of a kick up the bum, to be able to
Yeah, I
say,
think
look, there's
so.
some real consequences
Yeah.
here too. And you already are wagering simply
Mhm.
by how you live and what
Yeah.
you choose to entertain with your conscious reason. You're
Right.
already leaning in a particular direction. Maybe it's just worth exploring Christianity a little bit. I appreciate that. Well, no doubt you're aware then, and I want to maybe apply this in a particular area and draw in some of the other resources from Pascal, of their huge growth in the argument from divine hiddenness. It's become very popular amongst secular thinkers. It's developed originally by John Schellenberg. We may just chuck it up so that people can get a sense of what the argument looks like. But this dates back maybe 32 years to the original penning of divine hiddenness and human reason. Now, atheists like Alex O'Connor online have sympathized with this argument. They feel like as someone genuinely seeking after God, even exploring all of the rational arguments for God's existence and the evidence, that they just find themselves hopelessly agnostic. And so divine hiddenness is kind of raised as one of the big objections to Christianity. If you have the arguments for the Christian story and the Christian case, then this was one of the ones on the alternative side, problem of evil, and particularly the problem of divine hiddenness. Now, Pascal has often been described as the great theologian of divine hiddenness, because he
Yeah.
doesn't frame hiddenness as an objection to Christianity, as some bug in the system. No, he sort of sees it as some specific feature providentially there as a
Mhm.
feature of divine love and God's wisdom. So I'd love to hash out from you maybe some of the ways that Blaise Pascal speaks to divine hiddenness. And if you feel like Pascal was sitting across from Alex O'Connor, someone who wants to believe but remains unpersuaded by public evidence or private experience, what might Pascal say to Alex?
Right. Well, I have a chapter in the book, Beyond the Wager, on skepticism and the hiddenness of God. And then I have another chapter in my big apologetics book where I go into a little bit more detail on skepticism and the hiddenness of God. Let me read a quote from Pascal that I think is very helpful. God so regulates the knowledge of himself that he has given signs of himself, visible to those who seek him, and not to those who seek him not. There is enough light for those who only desire to see, and enough obscurity for those who have a contrary disposition. So that's the Christian understanding, that God has revealed himself in nature and conscience. Read Romans 1 and 2 in that. And then also look at the tremendous arguments for the existence of God from natural theology, from fulfilled prophecy, from the uniqueness of Jesus, and so on. I think there is good, adequate, and sufficient evidence to not only believe in a God, but believe in the Christian God. So then you have to say, why is it that more people don't believe? And C. Stephen Evans has developed this in his book on natural science. He talks about, I think he uses the phrase cognitive freedom, and it's very Pascalian, that people can follow up the signs and the evidence and come to believe, but they could also, if they want to, ignore them or fail for some reason or another to be convinced by them. So this may seem very uncharitable, but I reject the first two premises. Um, I think God has set up a world such that he has revealed himself adequately, that if people have an open heart, they can see him and respond properly to him. And if they do, it's ultimately of God's grace. But he's also given what we might call cognitive freedom to turn away. So I think that all atheists have resisted God at some point in some way. Now, it might be now that they have resisted God to the point where they don't even know that they've resisted God. They're so confirmed in their atheism. So let's look at one. If a perfectly loving God exists, then he would ensure that there are no non-resistant non-believers. Well, he would ensure it. God gives enough evidence and enough reason to be convinced, but one can still turn away. So I think that there are those who say they want to believe, but they somehow can't. I think at some level, in some way, they're deceiving themselves. And You might say, well, isn't that just begging the question? I don't think so, because I've got quite a bit of this in my book on Christian apologetics. Uh, Self-deception is something that psychologists and philosophers have studied. And there are ways of avoiding the truth if you have some kind of an interest in doing so.
Mm.
And of course, the Christian view, and Pascal says this, is the ultimate offense of Christianity is not a lack of evidence or the complexity of Christian doctrine. The ultimate offense of Christianity is the cross of Christ that exposes us as sinners who need radical grace. And I think also something Francis Schaeffer said, that in one sense, Christianity is the easiest of all religions because God does absolutely everything for our salvation. We do precisely nothing, and we can do nothing because Christ has done it all through his finished work on the cross and the resurrection. But on another level, Christianity is the hardest of all religions because you have to absolutely humble yourself under the mighty hand of God and receive the condemnation from God that you are a sinner, you are under divine judgment, but that help is available, but that saving grace, that help comes from entirely outside of yourself.
Mm.
And that takes a radical humility, but that humility is the doorway into a new kind of life and into eternal life. So I think God sets up the conditions to make everyone culpable for their right or wrong response to him based on the knowledge that he's made available. And I don't think God is going to somehow overrule people's cognitive endeavors to force them to believe.
Mm.
I think he has given us adequate evidence that if you follow up on it and you humble yourself, that's the key thing, that you can see there is a God, and then you have the availability of the gospel message, that you will see the fuller picture of God's holiness, the mediatorial work of Jesus, the need for faith plus nothing, and so on. So if I could just go to my book for a minute, I put it this way, a little differently than how you read it, but I think it says exactly the same thing, really. This is the divine hiddenness argument. If God exists as all good and all powerful, there would be no honest atheist. That's how I put it. Since God would want people to know him. That is, no one could be rationally justified in their unbelief in the existence of God. There would be no non-culpable unbelief. 2, there are honest atheists. That is, there are atheists who are rationally justified in their unbelief. So there is non-culpable unbelief. 3, therefore God does not exist. So I'm denying that there are honest atheists in the final analysis.
Mm.
Now, that doesn't mean we say, oh, you atheists, you're suppressing the truth of God, you're offended by the cross, so we don't have to argue with you. By no means. We've got to give the very best arguments, cosmological, design, moral, ontological, conceptualist arguments. And I've tried to do that in my career, and other folks have done such masterful work, like William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland and Alvin Plantinga and Pascal and so on. So I think we've got the arguments available. And so since we have these arguments and we look at unbelief, it's legitimate to interpret the unbelief in light of our worldview. It's not begging the question. You know, we give the best arguments if we think we're convinced, and you still have these unbelievers and you look at their objections and they don't overturn what we take to be rationally satisfying and rationally compelling, then I think it's appropriate to take an element of the Christian worldview, that is the problem of self-deception coming out of sin, and apply it to the unbeliever.
Mm. And certainly, I mean, there's a number of ways to come at Schellenberg's framing of the argument, and you can attack really either premise, the idea that there are no non-resistant non-believers or honest atheists, as you share, and there's a lot of resource in the Christian story to draw from, and even just at a point of warning, something like Proverbs 20 verse 5, where it says, "The purposes of a man's heart are deep waters." and a
Yeah.
man of understanding draws them out. And there are so many motivations behind our conscious reasoning that sometimes it is very hidden to us, and that we need to be able to carefully kind of draw out. And so I appreciate that. The other kind of approach that Pascal doesn't seem to take is this notion that maybe God does have, in the same way that we create theodicies, morally sufficient or good reasons for allowing non-resistant non-believers even for a time.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that first explanation that Pascal gives out doesn't really cut the mustard with anyone who's listening, there are a number of other ways to parse that out as to why God may allow for a time people
For
to
a time would be the key.
stay in non-resistant non-belief. Exactly. And so I spelled that out in other videos on divine hiddenness on the channel if you want to check that out. I love this Ponce where he says in number 280, the knowledge of God is very far from the love of him. And I think that feeds into this enormously. Just because we know more light from God doesn't necessarily mean that greater revelation will lead to a softening of our hearts towards him in repentance and in devotion. Actually, it can lead to a hardening of God as well.
Well, think of the 12 disciples and think of Judas. I mean, Judas
Absolutely.
spent as much time with Jesus as Peter or John or anybody else, and he turned against him. So it's got to ultimately go to the core of the human person and how we respond to our maker in light of our own sin.
Exactly. Well, let's switch topics then. In Beyond the Wager, one of my favorite chapters to read is where you explore Pascal's view on natural theology and his sort of aversion to the typical arguments for God's existence that people might find ontological and cosmological and teleological and so on. What value do you think these arguments actually have in God conversations with people who don't yet believe?
Well, I think they can be very profound, particularly if people are atheists or skeptics. And something that I found to be very significant, I've been involved in apologetics for almost 50 years now, and I found the arguments from cosmology and biology to have gotten stronger and stronger as time has gone on. I mean, there have always been strong arguments for God's existence, going back to the 5 ways of Aquinas, and even before that, obviously, and self-ontological arguments. But when you look at the scientific discoveries related to the fine-tuning argument and to the specified complexity in biology and the irreducible complexity in molecular machines, the information argument that Steve Myers developed so brilliantly, the impossibility of the Cambrian explosion being explained naturalistically without some supernatural influx of information. Naturalism is getting harder and harder to defend as the evidence comes in. And the secular story we so often hear is, well, religion used to occupy a big part of culture and society and the intellectual world, and then science attacked it, and now it's only as big as your own subjective opinion. No way. I mean, the argument for fine-tuning is so powerful that a mind has to be behind all of these independently tuned variables. It's so powerful that these desperate philosophers and scientists created the multiverse theory. That, well, this is not the only universe, so we're just a lucky universe. There are an infinity of other universes that had no life. So you expand the probabilistic resources, and we just happen to be the lucky universe. Well, the only problem is there's no independent evidence that there are multiverses. I mean, this is the ultimate ad hoc response to an argument. So the fine-tuning argument has gotten stronger and stronger. The evidence from biology for intelligence being built into molecular machines, the DNA, the RNA. And so a lot of people have this idea that science refutes religion. It's okay, well, let's look at some science about fine-tuning at the macro level and at the micro level. And moreover, let's look at the evidence that the universe had a beginning a finite time ago. That is an extremely well-established theory in physics, the Standard Model. It all traces back to an original singularity, and before that there was literally nothing. So if something doesn't come from nothing, something had to begin the universe, had to create it, would have to be timeless, spaceless, vastly powerful, I think personal as well. So you take a sensibility of the culture that science gives us truth and science has rejected Christianity and say, oh, wait a minute now. How much do you know about physics and fine tuning? How much do you know about biochemistry and molecular machines, and the bacterial flagellum? How much do you know about DNA and RNA? They are literally languages. They are code. And what do you infer when you find that sort of phenomena? You infer just naturally intelligence at a level beyond the thing being described.
Mm.
And that is exactly what naturalism will not allow.
It's interesting just seeing the sort of rise in even simulation theory now among secular thinkers as a means of explaining why this universe looks so designed in a way, and how you can explain that away with it being coded by some alien intelligence that now we're performing some simulation on behalf of developing technology or resetting their history or something like that,
Maybe
which is
that's
just an interesting feature.
Yeah, that might even out ad hoc the multiverse.
Yeah. You were asked recently by Sean McDowell around what do you think is the best argument for God's existence? And I think you and Os Guinness were the two that refused to answer in terms of offering a specific argument. And I think there was some real wisdom wrapped up in your reasoning there. Do you want to share maybe your perspective on what you think is the best argument and why you responded the way that you did?
Right. Well, I said, what do you mean by best? Being a snarky philosopher that I am, what do you mean by best? Well, the best argument has to do with the person that you're addressing and the issue that is of significance. So let's say someone is kind of a deist. They believe in a God who created and designed the world, but they're not sure what to do with Jesus. Well, then I'm going to go to the reliability of the New Testament, the claims of Christ, the resurrection of Christ. What if I'm dealing with someone who's a complete nihilist? Well, then I've got to do some work on what is the nature of truth. Are there any things we know to be true mathematically, morally? So you've got to start there. Then you get to theism. Then you get to Christian theism. So I think that we have a total argument, a cumulative case argument for Christianity that has a lot of very strong arguments. But the question is, what argument to use where? Now, there are weak versions of design arguments, cosmological arguments, ontological arguments, but I think there are quite a few very compelling versions of each of those arguments. So there's not just like one cosmological argument, one design argument, one ontological argument, one moral argument. They're families of arguments. And within each family, you find cogent reasons to believe. And my approach is a cumulative case. So a cosmological argument will tell you the universe had a beginning in a vastly powerful, intelligent being. The design argument talks more about the mind of that being to arrange and coordinate things. The moral argument discusses God as the source of absolute moral reality. So you've got cosmology, you've got conscience, you've got biology, then you go to history, the reliability of the scriptures, you go to Christ, his claims. So you've got a total argument. And when you're dealing with an unbeliever, you always need to isolate their worldview. So as I said, if they're a nihilist, you got to start at ground zero and really work up to the reality of truth and the validity of logic and that kind of thing. Or, for example, if someone is religious, but they have the wrong religion, like they're a pantheist. So you don't have to talk about there being a spiritual realm or that materialism is inadequate to explain things. You've got to deal with the idea of Brahman, let's say, this infinite, unknowable, impersonal being. How do you make an argument against that for the Christian view? Now, you could particularize it and say, well, what is your favorite argument? Well, who cares? I mean, the issue is apologetic effectiveness. Now, I guess if I had to pick an argument that I have been enriched by and which I love to tell and give and have written about a lot, and which is somewhat unique to me as a modern apologist and how I formulated it, it would be that Pascal's anthropological. Because it's a one-step argument, it's existentially rich, you have all these magnificent quotes to draw from with Pascal. It speaks right to the heart. So I really love that argument. I think it's very profound. But the best argument, I think, as Oz said, the best argument is the best argument for the person you're talking to at that
It's great.
particular. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, can you spell out how you might, in conversation with someone, use the anthropological argument? So you're talking about Christian faith and they ask, oh, why are you a Christian? And you say, well, let me give you one reason that for me draws me towards the Christian story. How would you spell out the anthropological argument?
Well, I think I'd say, uh, despite our similarities with other living beings, there's a gap between the human and the non-human living being on the planet. It has to do with things like language ability, conscience, creativity. And how do we account for that gap, that difference between the human and the non-human, without devaluing the rest of God's living creation? Sometimes Christians don't give animals enough credit in their amazing abilities that we don't have, even emotion and the ability to weigh options in some fashion. But at the same time, there is some difference between the human and the non-human that you can trace through history. So how do we account for it? And I don't think that any naturalistic evolutionary explanation will account for it, because everything has to go from simple to complex and has to go from impersonal to personal. And it makes more sense to have a top-down kind of explanation that an infinite personal God created us in his image and likeness, and so we resemble God. It's not that somehow we've worked our way up from the slime through this unguided, impersonal material process, and voila, here we are with these vast mathematical abilities and creative abilities. It just doesn't serve as a very good explanation. So how do you account for our uniqueness in our greatness? And then also, how do you account for our very sophisticated implementation of evil? So sometimes people will say that, well, that person is acting like a beast, like an animal. And I say, don't be so nasty to the animals. I mean, what animal ever tried to exterminate another species? I mean, what animal ever tried to engage in a genocide? Or what animal has done some of the horrendously evil things? Now, you find some very nasty behavior in the animal world, but we're moral creatures that engage in this nasty, horrible behavior. We have a sense of right and wrong, very clearly articulated. And that's not so much the case in the animal world. Maybe not at all, but certainly not at the level or at the kind that we can do. So I would probably also say, well, in fact, also the Darwinian explanation for the development of life is inadequate. It's oversold. Often it's just assumed to be true, methodological naturalism. We can't assume any intelligent designer in biology or chemistry or physics. We just rule that out a priori, which is a classic case of begging the question. It could be that a design explanation is a better explanation than a non-design time, space, chance, matter kind of explanation. So this anthropological argument, I think, has a lot of direct personal existential effect. You can even go to your own conscience, your own desires for beauty and goodness, but you realize that you've fallen short, that you violated your own conscience. So how do we deal with that? And I think the anthropological argument pairs very nicely also with the longing for transcendence argument, because that's part of who we are as human beings. And Pascal has often summarized, this was not the actual quote, but it's a decent summary, that there's a God-shaped vacuum in every person that only God can fill. He actually talks about an infinite abyss that could only be filled by an infinite and immutable object, that is God. And you've got a similar argument with Augustine, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So you can combine those arguments. But a lot of people, when they sense their dilemma that they realize that they are unique and significant in the world, but they're also guilty before the right moral standards. They feel shame, they feel guilt. They will simply give up and distract themselves and divert themselves, and then get into the sin of what you talked about, apathy. Just, well, I'm just human. I can't fix this problem. I'm not interested in the religions. And then apathy can actually get into something worse, which is called acedia, which is the sin of not caring about the most important matters in life, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Just giving up on it and saying, I don't care. I don't want to know. I'm done with this completely. So there's not even that spark of pursuit and desire. And we want to, there's one thing that Pascal said, he said so many beautiful things. One thing he said, make good men wish Christianity were true and then show that it is. So make people wish it were true. If Christianity is true, we can know who we are as deposed kings and queens. We can be reinstated. We can be justified through the work of Christ. We can be glorified in the world to come. We can accept beauty and goodness as gifts from God and be thankful and be grateful. And the people that have studied happiness psychology for the last 30 years will say that one of the secrets, or not a secret anymore because they've studied it so much, of happiness and contentment is gratitude. Surprise. We've had that in the scripture from day one. God created a world that, even though fallen, is beautiful, and we should be grateful. I was talking to a graduate student about 30 years ago at the University of Oregon. We're looking at this magnificent sunset. And he said, when I see something like this, I'm so grateful. And I said, who are you grateful to? Long silence. Because gratitude is a relational attitude.
Totally.
It's a relational attitude.
And you can see that in Romans 1, that diagnosis of, although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. And there's nowhere to direct that thankfulness.
And that wasn't just like a one-liner, a gotcha moment. I really wanted him to think about it. And we had some significant spiritual discussions after that. I lost track of them many, many years ago. But, gratitude is not like a feeling of being full after you've had a nice dinner. That's just a subjective feeling. It's my feeling. Gratitude is intrinsically relational. You have to be grateful to someone for something. And if you feel gratitude at that cosmic level, then you have to have a person there to be thankful for. And isn't it interesting? These people are studying happiness, not just neuroses and dysfunctions all over the place. They're studying how people live well and happy and with a sense of satisfaction. One of the things they discover that gratitude is essential for having any kind of a peaceful or happy life.
Absolutely. And I think you've gotten onto a whole host of some of my favorite pensées in that explanation, particularly around just that desire for a relationship with God, and how, as Christians who experience God, we can then share that with people who are still searching and asking questions and doubting and wrestling in their skepticism. But that Pensée 425, and this is what I wanted to bring out with where you spoke about the God-shaped vacuum, that quote that's often misattributed, but he does get into that kind of idea. And he says, what is it then that this desire and this inability proclaim to us? But that there was once in man a true happiness, of which there now remain to him only the mark and empty trace, which he in vain tries to fill from all his surroundings, seeking from things absent the help he does not obtain in things present. But these are all inadequate, because the infinite abyss can only be filled with an infinite and immutable object, that is to say, only by God himself. And to describe the human condition of people seeking to try and find meaning and satisfaction and fulfillment and life, but only to find that the things we pour ourselves into, they feel good in the moment, but never ultimately satisfy. That's just such a diagnosis of the Christian story. Again, it's in Ecclesiastes, it's in the teaching of Jesus. You hunger and thirst, but come to me, the bread of life, to never hunger and thirst again. I find that in my own human experience so true. You try and fill your desire with something in the created world or under the sun, and it is a good gift, but it's never big enough to fill the longings that are in the human heart that God has put there.
Right.
I want to pick up on something that piece together a couple of things that you said. So this famous Ponce 187, men despise religion, they hate it, and fear it is true. To remedy this, we must begin by showing that religion is not contrary to reason, that it is venerable, to inspire respect for it. Then we must make it lovable, to make good men hope it is true. Finally, we must prove that it is true. What implications do you think this Ponce has for people wanting to share their faith in
Oh,
Jesus?
yeah. Well, that's sort of his programmatic statement for how to engage in apologetics. And I gave a talk once just based on this fragment. I gave a whole sermon once just based on this fragment. I only gave it once. I'd love to give it again sometime. But the first thing is that we have, as fallen beings, a natural antipathy to God. I brought that up in the Hiddenness of God issue. I don't think there are people who are intellectually honest atheists. I think at some point they turned the wrong way. They turned against God. And so God has set it up that there are really no, in the final analysis, intellectually fulfilled or intellectually honest atheists. So we come back to that. So men hate religion and are afraid it may be true. That's part of the human condition. Read the first chapter of Romans on that especially, or Psalm 14, the fool says in his heart there is no God, and so on. But then Pascal says, okay, realize that you've got a battle here. This is not going to be easy. Apologetics is never just giving evidence and expecting people to say, okay, premise 1, 2, 3, 4, conclusion 5, voila, now, okay, get baptized and join the church. We've got a lot of prayer and spiritual warfare and relationships and listening and having the non-Christian attack our view, and then we try to humbly respond to their view. But he says, make good men wish it were true. What does he mean by good men? Well, he's really in the Jansenist camp of Catholicism. I don't think he was ever completely a Jansenist, but they believed in the sinfulness of sin. They're very Augustinian about sin. So they're not Pelagians, semi-Pelagians. So are they really good men? Well, good in the sense that we're made in the image and likeness of God, and we have an awareness of God that is natural to who we are, but we still have an awareness of what the good life would be. So what if there's a religion that can help you, that can bring you to terms with your own conscience? What if you could know that you were forgiven and justice was still served through the death of Christ because he vicariously paid the penalty and took the punishment? What if that were true and you were declared not guilty? And what if you were given the Holy Spirit to guide you? What if you were given a book that is a guide for life in every area of life? And what if you could even face aging and death with courage and dignity because Christianity is objectively true? Wouldn't you want that to be true? Now, of course, the way in is coming before the cross and saying, God, have mercy on me, a miserable sinner. Francis Schaeffer, who's one of my big influences, I think he and Pascal are my two biggest influences, said that when we come to God, we have to lift up the empty hands of faith. Or I think it was J.I. Packer who said the only thing we contribute to our salvation is our need for salvation. So we come to the grace of God that is wrought through the achievements of Christ. And to do that, you have to give up on any merit of your own, any even tiniest element of goodness that could merit or warrant your own salvation. But once you do that, you are justified, you're forgiven, your sins are atoned for, the Holy Spirit works within you to guide you and to continue to forgive you because you continue to sin after you become a Christian. But you don't have to end up in despair or terminal self-hatred or, just all the terrible things that people do to themselves because they can't live with themselves. We have a guide a model in Jesus. We have the wisdom of the scriptures, and we have the living presence of God in our
Mm.
lives and in the church to take us through the toughest times. So make good men wish it were true. I mean, if anybody's listening to this who's not a believer, wouldn't you want that to be true? Uh, and it is. This is not just something that we made up
Mm.
because it fits human needs. This is something that's objectively true, verified by science and history and human experience. And Jesus invites us into that life. Come to me, all you are burdened and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. I think it was Augustine who said, I learned a lot of wisdom from Cicero, but he never said, come to me, for I will give you rest.
Yeah.
That's an entirely different kind of claim.
Yeah. One of the things I appreciate about sort of this three steps is it seems to be this is where culture is going at the moment. I mean, with the new atheists 2 decades ago, there was this religion is not respectable. In fact, we
Yeah.
should deride religion. It poisons everything. But I think the meaning crisis that kind of catalyzed then in a secular culture, people now are looking back and realizing, wait, there's something to Christianity. If nothing else, it's given us so many rich
Mm-hmm.
inheritances in the West. And so there's a growing respect, again, I think, for the Christian tradition and for the many who have been compelled by it. And I think this is the moment then is say, okay, what would it mean if this is true for you? What value would that add to you? And so
Yeah.
definitely a very, very cool opportunity to be able to set out what would be the good things to make sure that it is,
Yeah.
make it attractive.
Right.
I wanted to share maybe one more thought that's incredibly relatable for me, where in Ponce 370 and 372, Pascal says this. He says, a thought has escaped me. I wanted to write it down. I write instead that it has escaped me. And in writing down my thought, it sometimes escapes me, but this makes me remember my weakness that I constantly forget. This is an instructive to me as my forgotten thought, for I strive only to know my nothingness. I just thought you're talking about that humbling influence. I don't think I relate to the genius of Pascal anywhere near as much as a comment like that, where you have these thoughts, but then they escape you, and then you don't know what to do with that, other than to say, you know what, I'm a humble, fallen human being. I'm not there yet. And so that's very cool. Do you have any other Sorry, you go.
There's something about that fragment. A lot of people don't know that Pascal was in very bad health for most of his life. I see a little one looking at your books back there. I like that.
Yes, I think he's awoken from his sleep. For anyone that's watching this live stream, it's like 6 a.m. in Australia on my end. So the
family
little
woke up
heads
and
start
what's
waking
Daddy
up.
doing?
Absolutely.
That's
Totally.
great. I love it. I love it. So he was in very bad health for most of his life and was in a lot of pain, especially the later part of his life. And he was so brilliant that he typically didn't write down a lot of his ideas until he was ready to write the final version. And later in his life, he was having a little trouble with his memory that he typically didn't have. So he started writing out the thoughts. So he very much felt his own weakness. And Pascal was, I think, the most brilliant man of the 17th century in Europe. Descartes would have disagreed that that was his egotism, not a warranted judgment. There's kind of a rivalry between Descartes and Pascal.
Correct.
It's interesting to think about. But as a Christian, as brilliant as he was in mathematics, in science, in polemics, in philosophy, I mean, he invented the idea of the syringe and probability theory. Where would we be in society without probability theory and hydrostatics and Pascal's triangle? I think one of the most brilliant people who probably ever lived. And yet he knew as a Christian, first, that all of his gifts were from God. And secondly, that he was still a finite being who would decay and degenerate and die. And he died at a very young age 39.
And there's another Ponce where he reflects on this and he says, the end of all reason is to realize that you're finite and that you're only grasping at the infinitude of what is to be known. And
yeah,
so
it's actually
that's the chief end, is
reasonable.
come to this humble position of realizing, hey, I don't know everything. and therefore what do I need to
Yeah.
infer
Yeah.
on that basis in terms of maybe
Hmm.
God is bigger than me and he has reasons
Right.
beyond the reasons that I have,
Yeah.
and my rational faculties have limits in themselves. I'd love to get your thought on this, in Ponce 277, where he says the heart has its reasons which reason does not know, we feel it in 1,000 things. People often have this sense that there's something, but I'm also maybe intellectually skeptical. What's your thoughts on that particular
Mm.
contribution?
Well, I have another book called Philosophy in 7 Sentences, and that's one of the sentences that I look at because I think it's extremely profound and also very typically misunderstood. And the way it's typically misunderstood is Pascal is saying that when it comes to religion, all we have is feelings. We
Mm,
don't have anything to contribute with our reason. So they're understanding heart to mean emotion, and then they're relating that emotion to some kind of feeling with respect to God and religion.
mm,
Well, where do I start? For Pascal, the heart is an epistemic organ. The heart knows things that we don't know through reason. And by reason, he means basically rational calculation based on a priori principles or empirical observation. So that accounts for a lot of our knowledge, but a lot of our knowledge, to use the technical term, is gained a priori. It's innate to us. And that's what he means by the heart. The heart has reasons, justifications that you can't gain through inferences and empirical observations, but it's still knowledge. So
mm,
to jump ahead quite a bit to Alvin Flanagan, I think this is what he meant when he talked about properly basic beliefs. They're beliefs
mm,
that are grounded, they're not arbitrary, they're not relativistic, but they're not, strictly speaking, based on or derived from other beliefs. Rather, you have these beliefs and they're part of your noetic structure, but they're at the basis of the noetic
mm,
or intellectual structure.
mm,
So he's saying that we can know things, here's another word for it, through rational intuition.
mm,
Not everything is from the outside in. Some things are from the inside out. And he realizes that God often speaks directly to the heart. However, he says we have good reasons from history and philosophical reasons to believe in God. So he's not saying, well, religion is a matter of the heart. You just have to feel it. And if you don't feel it, what can you do? That's it. Not what he meant. Again, if you think Pascal committed a very elementary, silly mistake, remember
You've probably
Pascal is smart.
misunderstood him.
Yeah, Pascal is smarter than you are.
Yeah, I just think
Even
that's such
when
a
he's
helpful
wrong,
point,
he's
just to be
smarter than you
generous.
are.
Yeah.
Be
Oh,
generous.
that's something
Yeah.
that's very humbling when you do your PhD thesis disagreeing with him. So I appreciate that hard won lesson on your part. Do you have any other insights? And we'll bring this up to a close, but just any other insights from Pascal's pensées that you wish bled into modern conversations about God?
Well, I think one of them would be what an astute social critic he was,
Mm,
because he realized that we were fallen human beings. We were deposed kings, as he put it. And there's a lot of posturing and silliness that goes on in the world where people try to pretend to be what they aren't. So he talks about the imagination, that we attribute significance to ways of dress or titles that are way beyond the objective merit that these things have. So
mm,
people, judges, dress in a certain way, and we think, oh, look at, they have a robe, they must be wise. Or we see this big political demonstration or big political fanfare, and we think this person must be a just and wonderful leader. And he realizes that in a fallen world, our imaginations can contribute false significance to things. So this is part of his understanding of human nature. And I've got a short chapter in the book that addresses this. I think it's very helpful to not be swayed by the world. We're told to be skeptical, to watch out for the world, the flesh, and the devil. And Pascal has a number of pensées that relate to exposing worldliness.
mm,
One of my favorite ones is He said, when everything is moving in the same direction, when everyone is moving in the same direction, it seems like nothing is moving, like when you're on a ship.
Yeah.
And he said, when everything is moving towards depravity, it seems like nothing is moving unless someone acts as a fixed point to show that people are moving towards depravity. And the fixed point is ultimately God and God's revelation. So culture can say men can be women, women can be men. Culture can say that sexuality is nothing more than urges and social conditioning. A culture can say ugliness is beauty and beauty is ugliness. But you can say Jesus is just one of many masters, and how could you be so narrow-minded to think he's the way, the truth, and life? But if someone acts as a fixed point, you show that these other views are actually depraved. They're false.
Mm.
And they're unreasonable, too. Because, in the sociology of knowledge, if an ideology captures the media and captures the academy, then people just generally believe it, whether or not there's any rational support for it.
Mm.
Because there's such a big difference between plausibility, what's generally believed, or what has been demonized as beyond the pale, like challenging Darwinism or something like that, or Jesus is the way. The big difference between the sociology belief and actually having rational justification for your belief.
Mm.
So in apologetics, we're after rational justification injected into a social system that may not want to believe what we believe. So we need all the rhetorical, intellectual, spiritual resources that we have. And I think one of those from Pascal is this idea of unmasking worldly pretense. He was really a master of doing that as well.
Mm. Yeah, you think about Ricky Gervais's speech at the Golden Globes or the Grammy Awards or whatever it was a couple of years ago, where it's comedically takes the mask off some of the darkness behind Hollywood. And it's just one of those real moments. He's in no way a believer. He often is rubbishing sort of Christianity and religion in his stand-up. But that's the kind of thing where you're able to describe what's really happening in culture in a way that people go, oh, I'd never even noticed, or I didn't see it like that. And it just opens them up. I think you're right on the kind of social conditioning as well. Showing the culture of Christianity and the community of Christians is going to be one of the greatest opportunities for people to see life through a different lens, and maybe that becomes attractive as well. But I want to say a huge thanks, Doug. We'll pull this up because you've been incredibly gracious in giving so much time helping us to dive into the thought world of Pascal and many of the contributions that he brings. If anyone's joined sort of partway through, this is Doug's book, Beyond the Wager. Brilliant introduction. Each chapter kind of picks up on a different theme that's brought out through the Pensées, as well as some explanatory commentary on his life and particular theological context and situation. Really worth picking up and digging more. If you haven't read Pensées before, it's a fascinating read. So you'll find yourself just being sparked by a couple of lines of text, just having to wrestle with that and sort of play out in your imagination what the implications are. It's really, really worthwhile as a text to reflect on. But Doug, if you had a parting message for anyone watching this who maybe yet isn't persuaded to believe in God or to follow Christianity, what would your encouragement to them be?
Well, open your heart, open your mind, pursue the best arguments for Christianity, talk to thoughtful Christians. You can actually pray without believing in God. You can pray as an agnostic. People have come up with agnostic prayers. That is, God, if you are there, please show me. And if you show me, I'm willing to follow you because you are God and I'm not. That's the agnostic's prayer. I think it's completely legitimate. So there is just a wealth of resources, and I've seen apologetics expanding wonderfully in the last 30 to 40 years at the highest academic level, at the intermediate level, and at the popular level, and even at the level for children, like Mama Bear apologetics, which you may have heard of. A lot of my writing is sort of between the highest level and the intermediate level. I've written technical articles, but even my big apologetics book, I try to make as approachable and interesting as I possibly can, because I am utterly convinced that the Christian message is objectively true, compellingly rational, and pertinent to the whole of life for time and eternity. So that's something to take extremely seriously if you're not a Christian.
Definitely. And we'll put links to your books as well as to your website, which just has a great overview of what's available down in the show notes on YouTube if anyone wants to check that out further. Doug, just want to say a massive thank you for joining and helping us dive into and encourage us to take seriously Pascal's wager, to put, if we are unpersuaded yet by the evidence for God, ourselves in the game, to bet, to wager, to realize the stakes, and to investigate sort of the wisdom and truth of Christianity in the kind of places that help us to wrestle with it. Just want to say thank you for your time.
Well, you're welcome, and you have been a very good interviewer. You know, I've done hundreds, maybe thousands of interviews now. I'm an old guy, an old philosopher, and you had the chops. So thank you so much for preparing so well and giving such a great interview. Thank you.
I appreciate that, mate, very much. And for anyone who's just watching and made it all the way to the end, we want to say a huge thank you for being involved here at Questioning Christianity. Our real hope is to create resources and videos, and over on social media, Facebook and Instagram, infographics that help you wrestle with the Christian story and why it really is worth believing. If you liked this, please share it with someone. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, do that now, and then go and find us on other social media platforms or at questioningchristianity.com. Until next time, truth invites questioning, and we'll see you later. Thanks for watching.